Thank you so much to the Institute for the invitation to lead this seminar, and thank you in particular to Weji for all the communication and all of the organizing work. I'm really delighted and honored to be here. So I'll dive right in. I'm going to start appropriately enough in the month of Ramadan, but in a time and place distant from our own, in the year 1079 Hijri, or this is the month of February 1669 in the Gregorian calendar, in the oasis city of Sijil Massa, which is in present-day southeast Morocco. It's marked here on the map with a blue X. And it was in the month of Ramadan in this year that, according to a young man named Muhammad ibn Umar ibn Abi Mahali, that he first encountered a problem in his community that would become something of an obsession for him. And he explains this encounter in a treatise that was written perhaps some months after the fact. And he writes there that the first thing that occurred in our presence was with regard to a person who had completed the Quran several times before that moment. One day he was reciting a prayer, and when he finished, he said, Gabriel, Jibril, descended with it to our Lord Ali, may God be pleased with him. Then it was said to him, is Ali a messenger? Hal Ali Rasul? And he said, yes. Then it was said to him, and who is your Lord? Man Rabbuka? And he said, our Lord Muhammad. Ibn Umar was shocked by this exchange. How could someone sufficiently learned as to have read through the Quran several times make such basic errors, he wondered, mistaking the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law Ali for a messenger and identifying Muhammad as God. Ibn Umar reports that in the wake of this episode, he and some of his companions began to probe other people's creedal knowledge. He says, those we know and those we do not know from among the people of the Tafilad and the Haris and other quarters, so people questioning people in the area. And they were horrified, according to their own reports, by both the ubiquity and the severity of people's ignorance of these basic creedal tenets. Ibn Umar's response to this alleged ignorance was to launch a multi-pronged campaign of teaching, quizzing, and disciplining people with regard to their doctrinal knowledge. And on the teaching front, which will be the focus of this presentation, he reports that he composed for these ignorant people in his community, quote, an easy, clear creed, an informal, uninflected language as an alert to that which we observed in them, these errors, and in accordance with their language and convictions. According to Ibn Umar, his practice was to recite this clear, easy creed aloud each evening after the Asha prayer from one of the mosques in Sijil Massa. He moreover encouraged the people listening to return home and teach the creed to their family and other dependents so that they too would benefit from it. And Ibn Umar's own assessment was that this effort was quite successful and that, quote, most people in his locale, old and young, and even the women, memorized the creed. Now, if Ibn Umar considered his teaching successful, other religious and scholarly authorities in the area were of a different mind. For example, the renowned scholar Al-Hasan al-Yusi happened to pass through Sijil Massa while Ibn Umar's campaign was taking place, as may be familiar to some of you from Khalid al-Ruwayhib's study of this incident. And al-Yusi describes the activities in Sijil Massa in very different terms. And he says of Ibn Umar that he went to extreme lengths in explaining the tenets of the creed to such an extent that he would fall into ways of speaking that are disrespectful to God the Exalted and intolerable to anyone with a sense of the majesty of God the Exalted. His classes would be attended by uncouth Bedouins who would go back to their people and start posing questions of such a nature to base people like themselves. Where does God live? Where does he go? Where does he stay? Where is he? And what is he like? In short, al-Yusi disapproved not only of what he saw as Ibn Umar's poorly executed efforts to simplify and explain creedal tenets, but also of his empowering less educated people to take up the questioning and teaching themselves. These dynamics are, I would suggest, highly reminiscent of those analyzed by a colleague of mine in Ottoman studies, Nir Shafir, in a 2020 article about what he calls vernacular legalism in the early modern Ottoman realm. Shafir uses the term vernacular to denote not the use of a regional language, so he's not talking about writings in Turkish, for example, but rather the use of a language that would be accessible to a broader audience and empower that audience to participate in discussions that might otherwise be beyond their educational level. The specific discussion that Shafir examines is a 17th century debate over the appropriateness of identifying oneself as a member of the religion of Abraham. And in Shafir's study, he analyzes efforts by one member of the educated Ottoman religious elite to harness and direct the discussions on this topic that were taking place among less educated members of the Muslim community. And then Shafir also explores the negative reaction to those vernacularizing efforts by other elite educated figures. And I would suggest that a similar tension about whether or not to vernacularize is at work in the historical episode that I'm going to be discussing today, which I've just sort of introduced here. Whereas Ibn Omar promoted activity in what we might call vernacular creed, his critics were much more wary. They were much more cautious about opening up creedal discussions to a broader, less educated group of people. Now, the fact that both the episode examined by Shafir and the one that I'm looking at today took place in the 17th century is not lost on me. Making sense of this historical coinciding and the coinciding of other related phenomena is a big question, and I should just say up front, it's not one I'm going to tackle today, though I would be very curious to hear people's thoughts about this during the conversation afterwards. Instead, what I do want to focus on today are the particular contours of the efforts and disputes with regard to vernacular creed. That is, whereas Shafir describes his focus as vernacular legalism, I'm interested in the degree to which the specific context of creed, of discussing the sensitive but all-important topic of God's nature and the nature of revelation, brought up particular challenges, particular pedagogical methods, and particular sort of points of dispute and argument for the 17th century scholars of the far Maghrib. So just to give you an idea of how the presentation will go, and I'm hoping it won't run too much beyond 40 minutes, I'm going to first lay some groundwork for understanding Ibn Omar's teaching efforts by looking at his own explanations and motivations for them, with reference both to their intellectual context and to some of the practices and the circumstances of his day. And then I'll take a closer look at what his actual teaching activities seem to have been, examining what it looked like for him to quote unquote vernacularize creed. And then finally, I'll turn briefly at the end to Ibn Omar's critics and discuss some of the issues that they had with his approach to creedal teaching. In doing so, what I'm ultimately hoping to do is to shed light on a key area of inquiry that at least to my knowledge, I don't think has received enough attention in studies of Islamic creed. My sense anyway is that most investigations into creed in Islamic studies focus on the doctrinal content, taking note of the ways that creeds function to produce and promote the orthodoxies of a particular time and place, and the way these creeds also marked either explicitly or implicitly what authorities of the time saw as the most threatening heresies that they were facing. And I think what gets overlooked somewhat in this focus on intercommunal boundaries is the question of who within a community creeds were for, and how authorities envisioned different members of the Muslim community might engage with those creeds. And what I hope to show here today is that these types of questions, these intra-communal questions, could be as urgent as the matter of doctrinal tenets themselves. Okay, before delving into the material as I just laid it out, I do think a brief word is necessary on the sources that I'll be using as well as their author. I mentioned at the top that the apparent instigator of the creedal campaign in Sijil Massa was a man named Muhammad ibn Omar ibn Abi Mahalli. We unfortunately know very little about this figure. He doesn't seem to be included in any of the biographical dictionaries where we might expect to find him, or at least I have not been able to find him yet. Nonetheless, we can piece together a basic picture of him from references in his own writings, as well as some writings by his critics. Ibn Omar seems to have come from a family of judges. His uncle, for example, served as an important judge of quite a large region stretching from Marrakesh in the west to the Tuat Oasis in present-day sort of south-central Algeria in the east. As would be expected from someone from such a family, Ibn Omar appears to have undergone a thorough education, presumably in Sijil Masa, but also at the Sufi lodge, the Zawiya of the Nasiriya Sufi order, which was also an educational institution located in Temgrut, which was just a bit to the south of Sijil Masa. Now, not only is Ibn Omar a somewhat elusive historical figure, but moreover, all of his writings remain in manuscripts. I've so far counted around 16 distinct texts by him, the vast majority of them having to do with his efforts to promote creedal teaching. Most of these texts are what I might describe as exhortative treatises, where he lays out his ideas and he urges others to take them up. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not reading the treatises in their entirety as examples of vernacularization. I don't think he meant the treatises themselves to be sort of widely distributed. And I say this based on their length, their sophistication, the way that he addresses his audience, all of which makes me think that he had in mind an audience of more scholarly peers. But when it comes to the creed itself, which he includes in one of these treatises, it seems to me that he has a more general audience in mind. And so when I get to this discussion of vernacularization, I'm going to be focusing on the creed specifically. Okay, so then diving into things properly, I want to start with this question of why vernacularize creed. We want to understand why he was undertaking these teaching efforts. As reflected from the quotation that I read out at the opening of the talk, the impetus for Ibn Omar's concerns was an encounter with someone who he deemed just egregiously ignorant of basic doctrinal claims, and then the subsequent discovery that, at least according to Ibn Omar, this kind of ignorance was widespread. So as a reminder, that first encounter was with someone who had some degree of learning, it seems. You know, this person had read through the Quran several times. And elsewhere, too, Ibn Omar highlights what he sees as the ignorance of people with a partial education. I think there's sort of an easy tendency to think of these past societies as somewhat two-tiered. I think this is especially easy given some of the language that we have in our Arabic texts, where they discuss the awam on the one hand and the khawas on the other hand, the general populace, the common folk, and the elite. But of course, it's good to keep in mind that reality was certainly more complicated than that, that it was not sort of two stark categories of people, but rather really a range, a spectrum of education and literacy. And we can see some of this at work in several other anecdotes that Ibn Omar gives us. I'll have three here, but I'll just sort of read one out since they're pretty similar. So Ibn Omar says, for example, then came another person reciting the Sohra from a tablet with a rosary and in constant performance of his prayers. A group of people gave him the fitra, thinking that he is knowledgeable. So we questioned him and found that he does not know that heaven and other entities were non-existent until God created them, among other errors. And then we have, like I say, similar dynamics in these other two anecdotes. And the sense we get from them is that in Ibn Omar's day, people with some degree of education, but who do not appear to be fully trained scholars, were out there sort of participating in spreading knowledge. So that is, in surveying the landscape of creedal teaching, Ibn Omar sort of looked around and he was already seeing that there was a range of people involved. And as I will suggest momentarily, Ibn Omar's reaction, I think, to this observation of his was to speak to this broader set of people, to perhaps we would say to educate them even further, to pull them into his program, into his way of seeing things. And in contrast to this, and as I will get to at the end of the talk, Ibn Omar's opponents were more cautious, I think, of empowering this partially educated set of people, or even worse in their eyes, people who maybe lacked an education entirely. Now, you will also see in these quotations, these anecdotes that I have here, repeated references to a text called the Sohra. And this is a particular reference to a text called al-Aqidah al-Sohra, the Short Creed, by Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sanusi. And the authority and ideas of this figure are key for understanding Ibn Omar's intellectual context. So I sort of just touched on a little bit of the educational on the ground context. Here I want to turn to the intellectual context, and for key for our understanding of Ibn Omar's explanations for his teaching activities. So I'm just going to sort of discuss that background and al-Sanusi's ideas for just a moment here. So al-Sanusi was a scholar of the 9th/15th century in Tlemcen, which is in present-day Algeria. He was, let's see if we have, yes. He was most prolific in the area of theology, kalam, aqidah, and his numerous theological writings really became the cornerstone of theological, this is Ash'ari theological teaching and scholarship in the centuries after his death, not only in the Maghrib, but also in the Sahel and in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as around the Malay archipelago. Al-Sanusi's most popular text, which we can see here, was Al-Aqidah al-Sughra, also called al-Barahin, or the Mother of Proofs. And in this text, Al-Sanusi lays out the 20, what he deems the 20 necessary attributes of God. So the attributes of God that are necessary for him, these are qualities like oneness, knowledge, power, will. And then Al-Sanusi lays out the 20 attributes that are impossible for God. These are the opposites of those first attributes, so impotence or ignorance. And then Al-Sanusi explains what is possible for God. And then he moves on and explains the necessary, impossible attributes of God's messengers. And in addition to these explanations, Al-Sanusi also includes a logical, syllogistic proof that demonstrates the soundness of each attribute. And the inclusion of proofs in this way is reflective of Al-Sanusi's stance on the issue of taqlid, or imitation in the realm of creed, which is a topic that, again, has been analyzed by Ruwayhib. Even before Al-Sanusi's time, again in the 15th century, Ash'ari thinkers in the Maghrib largely agreed on the definition of iman. They defined it as an internal mental act of doing tasdiq, or assenting to, and this assenting is meant to be to the veracity of core doctrinal claims about the nature of God and prophets. So this is, for Ash'ari thinkers of the Maghrib, iman is this wholly interior mental act of doing assent. So they agreed on this basic definition, but one area where they disagreed was on the question of, well, what comprises assent? What comprises tasdiq? What exactly goes into it? Is it different for different people in society? As discussed by Ruwayhib, Al-Sanusi took a pretty demanding stance on this question. According to him, it was insufficient for even the general, less educated populace to engage in mere imitation when it came to assent. It was insufficient to just sort of pick up and echo back creedal claims from the people around them without ever pausing to consider why those claims were true, why they should assent to their truthfulness. For Al-Sanusi, the only way to properly assent to the truthfulness of an assertion, was to understand the reasons why it is logically necessarily true. Hence, even in Al-Sanusi's shortest creeds, and it's worth noting here that the Sughra is not his shortest creed. There are two other even shorter ones. And even in those, Al-Sanusi includes a syllogistic proof for each creedal tenet. Okay, so if Al-Sanusi's major concern was taqlids, or imitation, Ibn Omar, 2 centuries later, he was feeling like he was seeing an even more basic problem in his community, which is to say he was seeing outright ignorance of creedal tenets. And indeed, he's very clear that the targets of his teaching campaign are not imitators. So he says, for example, do not think that this person, this person that he's discussing, is the imitator, the muqallid, over whom there is disagreement, as some erroneous people who do not understand the discourse of scholars have thought. The imitator is someone who understands all the creedal tenets and has absolute certainty in them without a proof. And the truth is that he is a believer, a mu'min. As for one who does not understand the creedal tenets or hesitate when asked about them, such a one has not even achieved taqlid, but rather is creedally corrupt. He will not be forgiven the ignorance, nor anything else. So the problem for Ibn Omar is not that people are engaged in imitation, that they're doing tasdiq, assent, in some kind of invalid way, but rather they don't even have a sense of the core doctrinal tenets to which they're supposed to assent. They're not even sort of getting to the stage where they might assent to something. They don't even know what it is they're meant to be assenting to. So the idea then, and turning now to Ibn Omar's method of teaching, was to offer people a creed that would correct errors that they had, and convey to them this basic information about the nature of God and prophets and messengers. And moreover, as I hope to show, Ibn Omar wanted to empower other people to take up those teachings and spread the word, not only spread the creed and the teachings, but also spread the word that anyone who failed to understand these basic creedal tenets was frankly among the kuffar, as he would say. They were among the unbelievers. They had not arrived at sound iman. And as a final note here, before I move on to the next section, I should say that Ibn Omar saw his effort as perfectly compatible with the teachings of al-Sanusi, even though they had different focuses. And indeed, at one point, Ibn Omar refers to his creed as a sulam, a step, to al-Sanusi's sukhra. That is, once people learned the very basics of creed, as he was going to teach them, delivered to them in this comprehensible way, they could move on to the commendable task of learning proofs. Okay, so turning now to the creed itself, I think what we're seeing so far is that in turning to teaching, Ibn Omar's overriding concern was comprehensibility, accessibility. These are really his guiding principles when it comes to vernacularizing his creed. And again, vernacularizing in the sense of making it accessible. So to get a sense of how he sort of set out to do this, again, above I quoted at the very outset, I quoted the line from Ibn Omar in which he describes his approach to composing his clear, easy creed. He says that he's going to use informal, uninflected language, that he was going to write the creed in accordance with their language and their convictions. And in another treatise, he describes his approach in similar terms, reassuring the reader of the treatise, who again I think seems to be more of a fellow fully trained scholar. He's reassuring this audience that he's not going to expose uneducated members of the community to excessively complex material. And he says, we do not add anything beyond this, sort of the basic level of things for them. Rather, we address them in accordance with their language and at the level of all those claims that each and every person understands. We do not mention to them proofs or specious arguments, nor substances, nor accidents. We have endeavored only to extricate them from the darkness of blatant unbelief, kufr, by any expression that they understand. In his article on vernacular legalism that I mentioned at the beginning, Shafir examines a passage by the 17th century Ottoman author Katib Çelebi, which disparages texts by the semi-educated. And from that passage, Shafir identifies several qualities of such texts. So he mentions, for example, in vernacular texts of the vernacular world, there's sort of a lack of differentiation between literal and figurative meanings, which would seem to indicate a lack of the person's training in rhetoric or balagha. These texts are not very well written, perhaps indicating a lack of knowledge, not just of rhetoric, but also of grammar, nahu. There's sort of a lack of maybe properly understanding how to deploy an argument and how to refute an argument, indicating a lack of training in the science of disputation. And then there might also be a lack of references to authorities. And Shafir then suggests that when more educated, sort of more capable members of the scholarly elite wrote in a way to reach out to these semi-educated audiences, they did so by tolerating these types of bad, quote unquote, bad reading and writing practices. And in the present context, I would suggest that it's maybe less that Ibn Omar is tolerating these realities than he is, I mean, maybe it's not so different, but sort of accepting these realities. He's, I think, invested in meeting people where they're at. And again, I think it's worth emphasizing that these are people who were already involved in reciting and teaching a Sanusi Sofra. So at least from Ibn Omar's perspective, like they're already out there doing this, it's worth engaging with them and channeling their energy and activities in what he sees as the proper direction. So with that said, I mean, I do think Ibn Omar's stated approach to creed has much in common with Shafir's description of vernacularization, and we might even add some further characteristics to the vernacularizing effort. So specifically, from Ibn Omar anyway, this stated intent to avoid using technical terminology. He's going to avoid high register grammatical technicalities, and he's also going to avoid logical proofs that might presumably be confusing for people. So this is the intention. And as for what this teaching looked like in action, I think I just want to state up front that we're pretty limited in the degree to which we can answer that question. Ibn Omar reports that he taught the creed orally, and that he would add explanations and clarifications out loud. And since no record exists of these oral lessons, our sense of his teachings must rely on the written text of the creed, along with several prescriptive comments that Ibn Omar makes about how to teach it to others. So with that in mind, turning here to the creed itself, the creed is in versified format, which would have made it easier to memorize, and it runs to 76 lines. With regard to the doctrinal tenets, the contents of it, I think the creed makes effectively the same assertions as other Maghribi Ash'ari creeds of the era. So to put it another way, I think Ibn Omar's strategy of simplification seems to consist less in restricting the topics that he's bringing to people, the topics that he's covering, and more in presenting those topics, those creedal tenets, in succinct and plainly worded fashion. But because of the difference in the language that he's using from other creeds of the moment and of the past in the region, it kind of takes a moment to realize that Ibn Omar is more or less discussing the same attributes of God and messengers as, for example, al-Sanusi does in the Sukhra. So Ibn Omar does not, for instance, foreground the usual technical terms for God's attributes, like wahdaniya for oneness, qudra for divine power, irada for divine will. And he does not use the modalities or the categories of necessary, impossible, and possible for characterizing the attributes. But I think nonetheless, he covers a pretty similar array of topics. So to just give an example here, so you can see this in action, in the Sukhra as a background, al-Sanusi enumerates God's status as the sole creator of all things. Nothing else has creative power in the world, according to these Ash'ari thinkers. And Sanusi discusses this under the attribute of divine oneness, that God is one, under the attribute of wahdaniya. Ibn Omar makes no mention of this term, wahdaniya, but rather he writes that God is the creator of this world and the next, and of the people in them both, and of the angels, the prophets and the jinn, of benefits and harms, of the pen, tablet, and throne, of the sky and the stars. And then he even after this continues listing other entities that God is the creator of. And in this way, he emphasizes that God is the singular creator. And this type of listing occurs several times. We can see another example of it here, where he's talking about the attribute of al-mukhalafa min al-khalq, God's distinctiveness from creation. So he's not characterized by any of these things, and he lists them off. And I really think this type of listing seems like a logical strategy for Ibn Omar. It allows him to correct specific misconceptions that he thinks he's encountered among people. So when he states elsewhere, so he has another section where he states, God has no spouse, no offspring, no son, sort of listing off all these relations that God does not have. And this seems to be sort of a responsive strategy because he thinks he's encountered people in his community who do have those specific ideas. And I think this strategy also works for Ibn Omar because since he has foregone the use of technical terms and logical syllogistic structures that can convey generalities, he needs another way to express generalities. So that is, whereas al-Sanusi uses the term wahdaniya and then a syllogism to demonstrate God's uniqueness as the creator, Ibn Omar offers his audience this long list of all the things that God creates, which I think he hopes cumulatively altogether convey a sense of generality. And presumably he considers that this approach will just be more accessible to his listeners. Now, as for the dissemination of this material, Ibn Omar, as I sort of indicated before, is concerned for more than just his immediate audience. So he's concerned for more than just the people who show up to his teaching sessions. He thinks that once people have undertaken sufficient learning of their own, they ought to teach others. And in particular, he seems to envision a teaching role for heads of households, since he frequently mentions the importance of teaching one's family and one's dependents. Yeah. And this effort to empower others, to empower people beyond sort of the hyper-educated scholarly class to take up creedal teaching, strikes me as a key aspect of what I'm calling vernacularization. To be clear, Ibn Omar is not simply sending his audiences off with, a pat on the back and a bit of encouragement to undertake teaching. He has very particular instructions for what people should do and standards that they should meet. In particular, he's adamant that mere memorization of creedal tenets is unacceptable. And to be sure that people are actually understanding ideas, he says that instructors should, anyone who's out there teaching should engage in a practice of examination or ikhtibar. So, for example, he says, repeat the creedal material, to them just as you repeat information about the world until they understand and become set in the truth without any doubt in it. They should respond to what you ask word by word. Don't be content with their saying, oh, we've understood, until you've examined them, until you've done ikhtibar. And don't be content with their utterance of there is no God but God, or of the 20 attributes of God, since memorization without understanding is like nothing at all. And then he also has this anecdote saying, like, this has happened to me with this elderly woman, who's prayed regularly. She used to attend our teaching sessions, but I said to myself, perhaps she has not left a state of kufr. So I questioned her about the creedal tenets, and I found her to be kafira with regard to many of them. She didn't know God from the messenger, nor that worship is toward God and not any others. Rather, she said that God worships another God. I asked her, does God eat or not? And she said that that should be capital H, he fasts until sundown. So I explained that to her and undertook examining her on the creedal tenets one at a time, and she came to understand. So this, this sort of checking process is very important to Ibn Omar. Now, of course, one may urge caution. When people come to Ibn Omar's teaching session, he's encouraging them to go off. He might say to them, be very careful and thoughtful about how you're doing this. But once ideas are out in the world, they can't really be bottled back up so easily, and you can't really control what other people are going to go off and do with them so easily. And it's here where the writings of Ibn Omar's critics give us a very different, I would say, less tidy, less virtuous sense of how Ibn Omar's teaching efforts played out. So turning now a little bit to the opposition. The three critics from whom we have substantive extant critiques are Al-Hasan al-Yusi, who I mentioned earlier. He was perhaps the most renowned scholar of the 17th century in the far Maghrib. We also have someone named Mubarak al-Anbari, a local figure in Sijil Masa, about whom the sources tell us very little. He also does not, as far as I can tell, turn up in Tabaqat works. And Abu Salim al-Ayashi, who was not himself a witness to the Sijil Masa events, but he heard about them from visitors to his family's Zawiya Sufi lodge in the Middle Atlas Mountains. And I indicated earlier that Ibn Omar's opponents saw his activities quite differently than he did. And specifically, I quoted the passage from Al-Yusi in which he described the disruption that he thought ensued from Ibn Omar's creedal campaign. And Al-Anbari as well described Ibn Omar and his followers as something of a local menace. They would turn up suddenly in mosques or at other gatherings, and they would ask people on the spot questions like, where is God, up or down? And then they would loudly condemn anyone who couldn't answer, or who sort of stuttered in their answer, or who didn't answer in the way they wanted them to. And even from his perch in the Middle Atlas Mountains, Al-Ayashi had stories to contribute, that he had heard about these out-of-control activities in Sijil Masa. In one of them, a butcher in Sijil killed 2 expensive bulls. And followers or people adhering to Ibn Omar's ideas came to him and asked, does divine sight correspond to both existence and non-existence, like existent things and non-existent things, or just to the former? This butcher couldn't answer, he sort of stumbled over his answer, and the questioners threw the meat to the dogs. Presumably, since they considered, well, this butcher is not a proper Muslim, he doesn't know his creed, and therefore this meat that he has slaughtered is illegitimate. It's not halal. And the sense from these stories is that Ibn Omar had unleashed a sort of misguided, bullying, almost persecuting force in the city, and people, so people beyond the educated elites were, participating in theological matters, but not in any way that these critics approved of. So they have faced the question then of, well, how to respond. One way was, them being scholars. Well, they're going to write some scholarly refutations of Ibn Omar's claims and actions, presumably, to go on the record against him and to alert fellow scholars to these ideas and to prevent them from spreading, at least among their scholarly peers. And I want to just linger for a moment here on the arguments that they put forward, just as a bit of intellectual history, and they're very related. So among the arguments in these treatises, which were several, one was effectively that Ibn Omar had kind of gone off course in his vernacularizing efforts. And we've already encountered this claim at the very beginning of the presentation with al-Yusi's statement that, quote, Ibn Omar went to extreme lengths in explaining the tenets of the creed to such an extent that he would fall into ways of speaking that are disrespectful to God the Exalted and intolerable to anyone with a sense of the majesty of God the Exalted. And al-Ayashi as well, when he's explaining how people who are teaching creed ought to proceed, especially when explaining God's transcendence, he says that they should lay out matters in a general way and refrain from stating specific things like, oh, God is not like such and such, or he's not like such and such. And I think that these comments are taking aim specifically at Ibn Omar's approach, where he just sort of lists off qualities, which, according to al-Yusi and al-Ayashi, this is really not sort of an appropriate way to go about conveying creed to people. So they're not saying, don't ever simplify anything, don't ever reach out to people, but there's sort of a correct way to do this. You're not doing this properly. Another argument in the treatises was that Ibn Omar's proactive teaching campaign simply was not necessary. These scholars shared the same fundamental understanding of Iman as an internal act of assenting to the veracity of core claims about God and revelation. But whereas Ibn Omar, based on his personal interactions with people, he was deeply skeptical that people sort of were doing Iman properly, that they had sufficient knowledge about these creedal tenets, and that therefore he was skeptical, again, about them having valid Iman. These opponents of his, these critics, had much more optimism, or at least they expressed much more optimism. And this optimism took a variety of forms. I'll just mention one of them. So al-Yusi and al-Ayashi posited, for example, that human nature, or fitra, includes an inclination towards sound Iman. Now, both of them considered that this fitra, this nature, needed to be activated. It needed to be pulled from a state of potentiality into a state of actuality. And they did think that a good way for this activation to take place was through teaching. It's a good thing to teach people creed and to have them learn it. However, in case someone just wasn't very disposed to learning, or just not very interested in it, this fitra meant that it might just be okay to leave that person alone. Better to leave them be, according to al-Yusi and al-Ayashi, than to scare them or confuse them with questions and teachings that were over their heads, clearly in the way they thought Ibn Omar was doing. Now, this optimism toward people's Iman, this idea of, people may seem ignorant on the outside, but we need to just trust that they have Iman on the inside. On the one hand, this seems like a quite generous stance, but I think it's also good to note how it works pretty effectively as an argument, or at least works intellectually as an argument for keeping people away from discussions of creed, right? If they're sort of good to go and it's better not to intervene, they're sort of laying down stronger barriers for saying, let's just trust that these people have iman, we take it in good faith, we don't need to intervene with them, and we're going to sort of block them off from these conversations if it looks like it's just going to be messy and confusing. So this is at least is the argument from optimism. But whether it was an effective argument, I think, is another question. One might imagine that these sorts of intellectual arguments they were putting forward in efforts to, in putting forward these intellectual arguments against Ibn Omar's very galvanized followers might just have a limited effect. And so I think it's not too surprising that the critics also undertook several other techniques, and I'll sort of finish with naming just several of them here. So one was al-Yusi's attempt to talk Ibn Omar out of his activities. Al-Yusi basically says that he went to Ibn Omar and said, hey, man, maybe let's loosen up a bit on this. Ibn Omar did not react very well to that and continued. Another technique was to reach out to the general non-elite populace on their own terms. And here again, it was al-Yusi who undertook this effort, albeit it seemed somewhat reactively when a group of people came to him asking his opinion on what was going on. And he basically said, if you guys have said the Shahada and you have basic, you're good to go. Don't worry about it. These steps do not seem to have sort of fully contained the activities. And so ultimately what happens is that city authorities in Sijil Massa summon Ibn Omar to a tribunal in order to face his critics. And notably, Al-Anbari, in his account of the tribunal, mentions that many non-elites, many members of the Awam, were in attendance, suggesting that there was a public-facing component to the procedure. Even though Ibn Omar did not, at least according to Al-Anbari, put up any real defense for himself, his supporters may not have been deterred, since Al-Anbari describes them as celebrating afterwards, sort of misunderstanding what had happened and continuing in their activities. The exact conclusion of this whole episode is actually very unclear. Al-Yusi, for one, indicates that it may not have fully died down for several years after this tribunal took place, until a bout of plague swept through the area in the year 1090, 1679. So I'm hoping I'm not going too far over time. I'm gonna wrap up here and just sort of reflect for a moment on what do we learn from this 17th century episode in the Far Maghrib. Because it was such a controversial episode, I think it makes especially clear what, and I mentioned some of these themes at the outset, what could be at stake in matters of creedal teaching within a community, not just in setting boundaries between communities, but what these stakes were within a community, which is to say, this question of how to properly and effectively ensure people's happy, sort of felicitous fates in the next world. And these stakes, raised all kinds of questions, not only intellectual ones about how Iman occurs, but also a host of practical questions like how to properly make creed accessible to people beyond the scholarly elite, the degree to which such efforts were even necessary, and whether there might be any role for people with sort of middling levels of education in all of this. But as controversial as this particular episode was, I do think these sorts of issues likely arose in many other historical moments. And so my hope is that this presentation today will speak to some of those and sort of spur more investigations into them. And with that, thank you so much for listening.